Thank you so much. I want to thank Sarah for that lovely introduction. All of the people involved in organizing this Lowell series. It's an enormous pleasure to come here tonight and to also to come back to Boston. Like many of you in the room, I was an undergrad in the Boston area. Not that far away from here, I went to Wellesley College. And for those of you who represent that part of the audience, the undergrads, I wanted to say that my interest in Galileo started with a class that I took as an undergrad on Galileo's Italy. You know, I had never encountered Galileo before that. Of course, I knew his name. He'd popped up in my physics textbook. You know, we'd redone some of his classic experiments, you know. And I knew that there was this trial, and that was about all I knew. But once I discovered the world of Galileo, it never really quite left me behind. So for many years, I've taught a course on the trial of Galileo. It's a subject I find perpetually fascinating. Not only, it's in many ways, I should say too, it's one of those subjects that reminds me of why many of us like to read mysteries, right? You know, in this instance, we know who did it. But the question always has been, what exactly was the crime? So Galileo is one of those perpetual historical mysteries. People have pored over and debated the documents, the veracity of the documents, and of course, in general, what we think about these events that produced one of the most infamous episodes in the history of the relationship between science and religion. So let me start here by reminding you, and for those of you who don't know, by telling you as briefly as possible a few things about the events of the trial. The starting point for this story is Rome, June 22nd, 1633. A 69-year-old Pisan mathematician, Italy's most famous scientist, who justly earned his fame for transforming the spyglass into a telescope, an instrument we now consider to be essential for modern observational astronomy, stood before the tribunal of the Roman Inquisition in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Clad in penitential robes, sick in body and mind, he humbly accepted his punishment for being, as the records have put it, vehemently suspected of heresy. So this, in short, was Galileo Galilei in June of 1633. And while my talk will not focus on his science, of course, I would be remiss without at least giving you a brief introduction to what had made him Italy's most famous scientific figure in this important century. I've often said that Galileo is a reminder that it's never too late in life to discover what you really were intended to do, because it was not until he was about 45 that Galileo truly realized his vocation, not as a mathematics professor, which he had by then been doing for many years at different Italian universities, but as an observational astronomer. In 1609, Galileo had turned rumors of a Dutch spyglass into a scientific instrument, the telescope. You know, and here we see one of the surviving examples of this Galilean telescope. It was emerged and perfected in this period. Galileo did what any curious and inquiring mind with a new instrument would do. He immediately began to use it. He turned it on the heavens, and he saw all sorts of things that he couldn't wait to report. His famous drawings of the moon, for instance, completely changed the way people thought about this celestial object. This seemingly perfect celestial body turned out to be full of all sorts of Earth-like imperfections, craters, valleys, all sorts of things. But Galileo didn't stop there. As he scanned the skies, he saw more and more interesting things. And in the weeks that he first began to use and perfect his telescope, he soon discovered some strange wandering stars in the vicinity of the planet Jupiter. And the more he looked at them, the more he began to realize, as you see here in the notebook that accompanied these and came out of these observations, that these were not simply stars that were wandering, but stars that were moving in a decisive pattern around this planet. He named them the moons of Jupiter, right? The 4 satellites of Jupiter. And it was at this point that he knew he had incredible discoveries he absolutely had to rush to publish in a book that he called The Starry Messenger. This appeared in 1610, hot off the presses, and made Galileo instantly a scientific celebrity. Now, Galileo's work as an astronomer and as somebody who thought generally about the heavens and all that they implied for understanding the natural world did not stop there. For the next decades, he would continue to observe the heavens, producing a host of fascinating, tantalizingly important observations that increasingly raised compelling questions about whether or not a traditional view of the cosmos, constructed out of the writings of Aristotle and the observational work of the ancient astronomer Ptolemy, really adequately explained what he and others increasingly saw through his telescope. The sunspots on the moon, the phases of Venus. All of these observations grew and grew as a body of knowledge that increasingly led Galileo to believe, as the 1610s went onward, that he had finally found the kind of observational evidence that made an alternative picture of the universe, a heliocentric universe, not just a possibility, but a reality. This heliocentric universe had been first articulated and sketched out in a very provisional and summary way in fragments of surviving writings of ancient astronomers. It was not actually a new idea, contrary to the popular impression. What was new was what Nicholas Copernicus did in 1543, when he, without a telescope, filled out this portrait, constructed a whole mathematical explanation of this possibility in his important book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres that he published at the end of his life in 1543. And here you see the famous picture of a heliocentric universe, a universe with the sun at its center, that came out of Copernicus's 1543 book. So Galileo's observations and this portrait of the universe increasingly worked together to create a new and increasingly seductive and compelling explanation filled with fresh evidence, with new techniques of observing nature. So this is what Galileo, as many of us know, offered in the period in which he became one of the most interesting scientific minds in the 17th century world. And by June of 1633, at least as far as Catholics were concerned, this universe had not only been long erased by decisions of the Catholic Church that this was contrary to Scripture, but was now decisively erased in relationship to the person of Galileo. So again, just to sort of remind those of you who already know the story, and to tell those of you who don't, how this comes about, it's not in 1633 that heliocentrism becomes a problem for the Catholic Church. That had already happened as a result of the increased interest in this scientific idea because of Galileo's observational astronomy, because of all the things he was observing in the early 1610s. So it was in March of 1616 that the Congregation of the Index met in Rome and placed Copernicus's On the Revolutions and other books that had also talked about the possibility of reconciling a heliocentric cosmos with Scripture on the index of prohibited books. Right, so from 1616 onwards, Copernicus's book in its original form was prohibited until corrected. By 1620, it had been corrected. One could not talk about the reality of this universe. One could speak about it as an interesting idea. We would say nowadays a hypothesis without decisive or compelling evidence, a hypothesis also that in fact posed all sorts of problems for the then literal reading of Scripture as far as its portrait of a cosmos, because the literal reading as of 1616 was decisively geocentric, right? So these are the key things that lead us to the point of the trial. This is the key background one needs to understand to think about the trial. Now, the circumstances of the trial, of course, rested not on the events of the 1610s, though they came back to haunt Galileo, but on what he had done in 1632. In 1632, Galileo had decided to publish a great and fascinating book that still today is well worth reading in any language. Since there are many translations, there's a very good English translation of this book if you've not read the dialogue. It's not a short book, but it's a fascinating book. Galileo had decided in 1632 to finally complete this dialogue concerning the two chief world systems that he published in Florence with the permission of the Holy Office in Rome. So he decided to publish this dialogue. This was a dialogue among three figures, two of them long dead friends, and one, a character named Simplicio, right? A bumbling, uneducated Aristotelian who believed firmly in a geocentric universe. These three characters argued the point of astronomy. They argued about the differences between the two chief world systems in a highly entertaining and raucous way that was a tour of virtually all of modern knowledge and culture, literature, art, music, science, philosophy, medicine. Not a single aspect of the 17th century world was left out of this book, because this was one of Galileo's masterpieces. This was one of his two important aspects of his life's work as a scientist, but as a scientist who was committed in the way that he worked to communicate what he had found to society, which is why he wrote this not in the learned Latin of the world he inhabited and knew so well, right, as a university professor, but instead in the vernacular Italian, in a lively and highly literary Italian that made this book, then as of now, a pleasure to read, accessible to anyone who could pick up a book and open this. It was the publication of this book that precipitated the events of 1633. And it was the wrath of his friend, Pope Urban VIII, that played a particularly important and confusing role, we would say even paradoxical, frustrating, tragic role in the ensuing controversies. In 1615-16, Urban was a young cardinal, who we see here, next to the image of him as Pope Urban VIII. And as a young cardinal, fascinated with knowledge, writing poetry about Galileo's discoveries, he had lamented the decision that he himself had participated in, saying later on in life, when he was Pope, at least according to a third party that recorded this and sent this to Galileo, that that decree had been a scandal, that if he had been Pope, at least this third party reported to Galileo, he would have never approved such a decision. But this, of course, was the same Pope who, towards the end of Galileo's life, instead said that it was Galileo, and not that decision, it was Galileo's dialogue, that was one of the greatest scandals that Christendom have ever known. So one of the great paradoxes that people have spent a lot of time on in understanding the story of the trial of Galileo is exactly this problem. How could a cardinal who lamented the decision of 1616, who wrote poetry admiringly about Galileo's astronomical discoveries, become the Pope who decided to condemn him in 1633, or we should say more accurately, who let this condemnation go forward through the hands of the Roman Inquisition, which included two of his family members on its commission. So this, in short, is the background that I want you to be thinking about as I turn to what I want to talk about now for the rest of the evening, which is the world after the trial. And I want to reflect a little bit on this as a historian who's thought a lot about this period. The tendency when you think about both the history and the literary imagining of Galileo that has gone on is to think about Galileo's life as if it stopped in June of 1633. We say very little about those final 9 years. The primary things that we say about the final 9 years of Galileo's life are the things that end up in our introductory physics textbook. That in that period, Galileo finally finished his great work of mechanics, his two new sciences, which is published in 1638. That he finally finished this book on problems of motion that he had been working on for his entire career while going blind, and at the end of his life and remained under house arrest in this villa outside of Florence, in Arcetri, where he was confined by the Roman Inquisition. So we tend to not say a lot about these 9 years. We say one important, very important scientific fact about Galileo's other important life work, his physics. We think about the tragedy, right, of a man who is confined to house arrest, who is slowly but surely going blind as the years go on, who has lost his eldest beloved daughter, the nun, who dies within months of him returning finally to Arcetri after his trial and condemnation in Rome, right? But ultimately, we want to paint those final 9 years as purely and only a tragedy. And yet, in reality, we have an enormous amount of documentation about this later period of Galileo's life. And what I want to do this evening is to reflect a little bit on what we actually see Galileo doing and saying, and those he closely associates with after the trial. So fundamentally, the point that I want to make here is to think about how Galileo, and by implication his entire world, lived with the consequences of the trial, right? Galileo's trial is on some level almost a meta-historical event, right? It looms so large that Bertolt Brecht wrote not one, but 3 different versions of a play to try to explain this low point, this dramatic high point, right, but psychological personal low point of Galileo's life. And what I'd like to do, and I think this again is the work of historians, is to think about how we can bring epic events that have long legacies for the world at large back down to a human scale and see if we learn something new when we look at this, not thinking of the long-term consequences and struggle over the meaning of the trial of Galileo, but thinking much more intimately about how Galileo himself lived with in this remainder of his life after the trial. What were these 9 years of like? And how did he deal with them? So one of the first things we have to think about is how Galileo actually left Rome and what he was doing as he left Rome during this period. All right, so let me now take you to the scene here that we started on June of 1633. Galileo's crime is so well known that I think many of you in the audience probably could give part of the lecture I've just given, right? And you may also be familiar with the key words of the trial documents themselves, but I want to kind of also, to move us forward with what he goes home with, I want to start off with some of the key phrases that come out of this moment on June 22nd. Galileo was tried and convicted of advocating 2 scientific propositions. First, that the sun is the center of the world and motionless. The inquisitors declared the idea of a heliocentric universe to be, as they put it, philosophically absurd and false, and formally heretical, for being explicitly contrary to Scripture, right? So heliocentrism was explicitly contrary to Scripture, but also philosophically absurd and clearly not true. Secondly, Galileo was condemned for the proposition that the Earth is neither the center of the world nor motionless, but moves even with diurnal, daily motion. The inquisitors found this second idea, a moving Earth, a planet among other planets, to be, as they wrote, philosophically equally absurd and false, and theologically at least erroneous in faith. So what did they ask Galileo to do in response to this decision? They asked Galileo to abandon these ideas entirely and to abjure them and condemn them and abhor them publicly, along with, as they wrote, every other error and heresy contrary to the Catholic and Apostolic Church. His recently published dialogue was placed among the books violating the 1616 decree, and Galileo was required to recite 7 psalms weekly for the next 3 years. This burden, by the way, at least briefly, was taken up by his eldest daughter, the nun, because that was the one way that she felt she could best assist her father, though since she dies in April of 1634, it was not for very, very long. Galileo was, in this moment, in penitential robes, asked to forgo all of these things that he had been working on and thinking about and arguing towards with, as the church insisted, a sincere heart and faithful belief, right? Galileo's sincerity in his abjuration of these ideas was absolutely critical to the way this moment was constructed, right? To the role that he was asked to play for him to exit this inquisitorial moment. So Galileo did that. His abjuration, his repudiation of his ideas literally used the words of the Inquisition that they had given him, right, as he was required to do. Having done this, he was then imprisoned, not especially harshly, since he was quickly returned to the villa in Rome where the Tuscan ambassador lived. And not long after that, the church too decided that it was in their best interest, perhaps even more than Galileo's, to have him leave Rome. So this is where we pick up now, is what happens when Galileo goes on the road, and how should we judge what happens next to the epic story, right, of how Italy's most famous scientist became the most infamous scientist of his century. Galileo was sent back to his native Tuscany, but not to Florence, where he lived, and not immediately to his country villa in Arcetri, just outside of Florence. He was first sent to the southernmost town of Florence on the road from Rome to Siena, where he stayed for a number of months, about 5-6 months. So what exactly did Galileo do in Siena? He stayed in the home of the archbishop of this city, named Ascanio Piccolomini, and he engaged in all of the conversation that staying in the home of the archbishop of an important city in Tuscany entailed. This, among other things, included wonderful discussions with the archbishop's brother, Ottavio, who would ultimately be important for one of the possible ways that Galileo's works were going to get a wider audience. Galileo was in enormous psychological and physical distress, right? He had already been ailing before he was forced to go to Rome by the Inquisition. And he was now at this point completely destroyed. It was the task of the archbishop, in many ways, to rebuild him in body and soul. And we know the effect, the positive effect of the months that he spent in Siena from his correspondence during this period, in particular his correspondence with his eldest daughter, Virginia, known commonly as Sor Maria Celeste, who was a nun in Arcetri and deeply concerned about her father's well-being throughout their lives together. What we see in his correspondence with his daughter is we see somebody who increasingly is overcoming the problems that he has faced with the encouragement of this intimate group of friends, starting first and foremost with the archbishop. We see that Galileo is finally eating well, he's taking pleasure in things, he's even doing mundane things like buying gifts for his daughters and the other members of their convent, meeting their needs, fine linens, citrus, etc., all sorts of things. He's taking the pills that his oldest daughter, who was a bit of an apothecary in her convent, is sending to help him. He's distributing them to his friends because apparently I think she had a bit of a reputation for making good medicine. So he's beginning to kind of, in the midst of extraordinary circumstances, to take up again a bit of normalcy in his life. But this, in many ways, is the least of it, though of course it was fundamental to his ability to do the more interesting things he was doing, because what he was also engaged in that comes out in a variety of sources, including, of course, this correspondence with his oldest daughter, is that he was also engaged increasingly in a set of interesting and pleasurable conversations, right, that were taking his mind off of all of these troubles and allowing him bit by bit to move towards what he most felt he needed to do. One, to think about how to get home. Secondly, to think about whether the sentence of the Inquisition could, if not be commuted, at least lessened in the burden that it placed upon him. And finally, last but not least, he began to not only think about, but to even work on his next book. This is not the image of Galileo that we have. If we end this tragically with the trial, This is the image instead of a Galileo who I think is far more interesting in many ways, somebody who, in fact, in the midst of this, was not only resilient, but even perhaps able to think ahead, to calculate what he needed to do to move forward in the very changed circumstances of his life, right? So Siena, in many ways, is a world in limbo for him, where he doesn't yet know when he can go home. He doesn't yet know how long or whether the terms of the sentence he has been handed in June will be indefinite. And he ultimately also doesn't know under what circumstances he can move forward with his scientific work. To what degree can he continue to do the work that he believes he was intended to do, to finish, as he calls it, his books on motion, the work that becomes the two new sciences in 1638. Now, this Galileo also looks a lot more like the Galileo even just before the trial, in Rome, before he knows the outcome of the trial, when he is optimistic in Rome that things might ultimately go his way. That Galileo in Rome is handing around a book that is always one of the paradoxes of the story of the trial of Galileo, that it never ended up on the index during this particular moment, largely because it was not yet published. This is Galileo's famous letter to the Grand Duchess Christina that he writes in the heat of the moment in 1615-16 as his longest and most articulate defense that the idea of heliocentrism is, in his view, not only not incompatible with Scripture, right, but indeed can openly be made compatible. That these two truths, as he writes, cannot contradict each other, right? The truth of science and the truth of faith must go forward to better. This manifesto, unpublished, widely circulated in draft form, was a book that he not only talked about in Rome to leading clerics that he thought might be sympathetic to him, but offered to send copies of this. We often don't pay attention to this fact, that in the midst of having arrived reluctantly in Rome to be on trial, he's doing these things. He's actively trying to defend himself with a document that he had written those many years before, when heliocentrism first became a problem. So this Galileo, during the trial, is slowly but surely resuming and re-emerging after the trial as well. As Galileo became more like himself in these months in Siena, not surprisingly, the behavior not only of him, but those around him caused some concern for the local Inquisition. The Sienese inquisitor noted that Galileo had been heard to say things that were opinions hardly Catholic. There was also enormous concern that the archbishop was way too much of a partisan of Galileo. He had been a student in mathematics and physics of one of his closest associates, was indeed a great admirer of Galileo's science. But the question remains for us. This is literally months after this epic dramatic trial, after the news of his condemnation has been officially publicized, right, through papal nuncios and vicars throughout the Catholic world. Mathematicians have been forced to go to readings in places like Florence to hear the terms of the decree, to hear Galileo's abjuration. The Sienese inquisitor is saying that he's hearing opinions hardly Catholic. And what does the Inquisition do? Absolutely nothing. So this is an interesting fact, even in these most immediate moments, right? That they do absolutely nothing other than to decide that probably he shouldn't stay in Siena, that in many ways Galileo is having too much of a life in Siena and resuming perhaps too much of a normal life. So their goal now is to finally do what Galileo had hoped, but not in the way he'd hoped, to send him to Arcetri, where he arrives in December of 1634. For the rest of Galileo's life, until his death in 1642, he was confined largely and very reluctantly to this home, to this villa. Galileo's efforts to circumvent the limitations that this placed upon him are a consistent theme of the 9 years of his exile in the vicinity of his beloved Florence. Soon after Galileo arrived in Arcetri, he wrote to friends that while he could not leave this villa, the world was coming to him. His old patron, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, made a point of leaving Pisa, not even neighboring Florence, right, but he was in Pisa at the moment, to come all the way to, as Galileo put it, talk with him personally for 2 hours, to indicate that while things had changed, the world around them had changed, that he, unlike the Pope, was still a loyal patron of Galileo within the limits of what the larger world permitted. Galileo was still recovering, as he wrote again to friends in this period, from what he perceived as a kind of vendetta, right? His words repeatedly about the trial was this was a kind of vendetta. He told his friends he would love to tell them more about what he thought about this, but they weren't things that he could put in a letter. But he said cryptically that he was very pleased that copies of the now infamous dialogue were being translated into Latin, right? So this is another fact we need to think about early on, is not only Galileo's behavior and what people do and don't do about this while he's in Siena, but also about the fact that he's already aware that contacts are beginning to think about the afterlife of this now controversial book and how to give it a much wider audience. The Roman story of his dialogue had concluded very badly in 1633, but the European success of his book was just about to begin. And this is what I want to kind of focus on in many ways, is how we get to this story that not only produces the publication of the 2 new sciences, of this important work on mechanics in 1638, but also produces many editions in Latin and other languages of Galileo's writings, or indirectly summaries of Galileo's work. But of course, the circumstances under which Galileo did this were complicated. Galileo felt, as he wrote in July of 1634, now having settled back in and reeling from the unexpected death of his oldest daughter, who had died in April, Galileo wrote to friends in various locations to say that he now felt the situation was getting worse. By July of 1634, his initial hopes on the lessening of the sentence, right, or the terms with which the sentence were carried out, were basically dashed. A few days before his daughter died, Galileo returned home, right, from tending his sick daughter, to find the Florentine inquisitor waiting for him with a letter from the Pope's nephew, Cardinal Francesco Barberini, who was a member of the Roman Inquisition that had condemned Galileo. And this letter told him in no uncertain terms that if Galileo didn't cease to ask to return to his house in Florence, which was his fondest desire, right? The image of normalcy is not to be in this villa outside of Florence, but to be in the home in the center of the city. They would, as the letter put it, make me return to the true prisons of the Holy Office. So this was a very harsh reminder that Rome awaited Galileo if he didn't play this game very delicately. And as a reminder of just how ominous the situation became, Galileo also recounted a story of a letter for him that had arrived in Rome after he had left the city. Since the recipient of the letter was not there, since the recipient of the letter had just been condemned by the Roman Inquisition, the letter was opened and delivered to Cardinal Francesco Barberini. It was a letter from an unknown person, Galileo says at least. We don't have this letter, so we don't really know. He had never met or corresponded with, had any relationship with, from somewhere in Northern Europe, speaking the praises of the dialogue and all the wonderful things contained in it. It was a letter from probably a Protestant, right, from somebody beyond this Catholic world that has made this decision, offering the other view of Galileo's work. Fundamentally, I think this letter that Galileo describes is a very interesting moment of the fundamental transformation that goes on in Galileo's reconstruction of his life after the trial, which became a break between those who had previously supported Galileo and those who still continued to believe in his pursuit of truth with the tools of science. So what I now want to get you to think about is, who are these supporters of Galileo? I've introduced you to a few of them locally. The Archbishop of Siena, his brother, the military commander about to go off for the umpteenth time to the battlefields of the 30 Years' War. His oldest daughter, alas now dead. So who else is supporting Galileo? And this goes back to some of the research that I've been doing with a number of students now, looking at Galileo's correspondence as an indication of how his world changed from 1634 onward. And with apologies that this is not a beautiful map, but I think kind of slightly informative, I want to just give you a sense of what we have been looking at and talking about. So this is a map of the letters that Galileo receives or writes from Arcetri, right? So in other words, from December 1634 until the end of his life, as much as this documentation has survived, what do we see? And these are the three most important correspondence in three different cities. None of them especially known to you, but certainly well known to specialists. One, who I'll talk about later at the end, time permitting, is Benedetto Castelli, one of Galileo's most important disciples. He was a Benedictine and a mathematician. In fact, he was the Pope's mathematician in Rome. He'd been sent out of town during Galileo's trial. He actually arrives back a day after Galileo leaves. It's one of the fascinating letters, right? In great distress because he's not been able to see him personally, and is prevented from going to Tuscany once Galileo is there until much later on, out of fear that he will do things that are not appropriate to his position as the Pope's mathematician. The other two that you'll see up here that I'm going to now talk about, one is the person to whom Galileo was discussing all of the things I've just been talking about. A Swiss Protestant from a family of Tuscan origin, named Elia Diodati. Diodati was from a family in Geneva that had famously left the Tuscan city of Lucca in the 16th century because they had discovered Protestantism. They fled to Calvin's Geneva, installed themselves, and became one of the important families in the city. But they also formed a network throughout Northern Europe. So Elia Diodati's cousin, Jean, for instance, was the translator of the Bible into Italian, a Bible that was brought to places like Venice. So Diodati is a very interesting example of the kind of friend who is essential to Galileo in this period after the trial. And he is absolutely crucial for understanding the ways in which a French community of both Catholics and Protestants support and embrace the need to uphold what Galileo stood for, right? The freedom to think and philosophize while remaining true to one's faith. So Diodati becomes an essential figure who Galileo corresponds with, as does the theologian for the Republic of Venice, Fulgenzio Micanzio. So notice how many of these people are in religious orders, right? Benedetto Castelli, mathematician and cleric. Micanzio, a Servite, a member of one of the Augustinian orders, right? The official theologian for the Venetian Republic. Diodati, no, obviously not that, belonging to a different world that is much more the world of Northern Europe. So let me now kind of turn to a bit of a reconstruction of what goes on in this period. Who belongs, for instance, to the French community that increasingly will be more and more important to Galileo's correspondence and to his plans for the work that he wants to do? Besides the Swiss Protestant, Diodati, there was the lawyer and parliamentarian, Nicolas Claude Fabry de Peresque, a master of an incredible network, a lawyer, but greatly interested in matters of science, and like many of Galileo's correspondents, a sometime astronomer. There was also his close associate, the priestly philosopher, Pier Gassendi. Both of them eagerly requested lenses from Galileo immediately after the trial to do their own observations to confirm and extend his findings. So this is, again, one of these facts we should spend more time on. One of the things the French are doing is doing more observations to confirm and extend Galileo's findings. In Paris, another cleric, Marin Mersenne, who was a great fan of Galileo's physics, especially his mechanics, regularly received news of Galileo from Elia Diodati, as did a recent arrival in this French city, the controversial Calabrian Dominican, Tommaso Campanella. You see him here in the center of the image I've given you. Campanella had become famous, indeed infamous, for his writings during 27 years of confinement in a Neapolitan prison for fomenting rebellion against the Spanish rulers of Naples. These writings included his controversial defense of Galileo and Copernican astronomy after 1616 in a little book that he published in Frankfurt in 1622. Quite ironically, again, if we want to think of this as a very tangled story, it was Pope Urban VIII who secured Galileo's release from that Neapolitan prison in 1626, intervening with the Spanish king and bringing him to Rome. In Rome, Campanella became, for a period, one of the Pope's favorites. By 1629, he was at complete liberty, and he was advising the ever-superstitious Pope on matters related to theology and philosophy, in particular the vexed issues of astrology and prognostication. As a result, Campanella was present in Rome for the events of the trial, raising an important question. Why is this Dominican now in Paris after the trial? While in Rome, Campanella had offered to defend Galileo. In September of 1632, when things were heating up but Galileo had not yet been forced to Rome, he wrote a letter to him that said, "I felt great disgust upon understanding that theologians of the congregation are to prohibit the dialogues, and no person will be in that council who knows mathematics," he wrote, "or about recondite things." In other words, they don't have the expertise and knowledge that they need to have to really evaluate the dialogue, in Campanella's opinion. In his assessment, he thought in September of 1632, the Pope had not yet made up his mind. "But for my part," he wrote, "I will write the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Galileo's other patron, that if they put Dominicans, Jesuits, Theatines, and secular priests against your books in this council, they should also admit Father Castelli and me." In other words, what Campanella said while he was still in Rome is that in an ideal world, this trial should have included two defense attorneys, Benedetto Castelli, the Benedictine mathematician and disciple of Galileo, and Tommaso Campanella, long released from prison by the Pope. It was, of course, probably a mercy for Galileo that no one accepted Campanella's offer. But in the end, it was all irrelevant. And by 1634, Campanella had done what friends encouraged Galileo to do when the Roman Inquisition first took an interest in his book and in person, which is leave the country, flee. Rumors of renewed efforts by one of his followers to overthrow the Spanish once again had implicated Campanella in radical politics, and so he left the Eternal City and the Italian peninsula behind, with the assistance of the French ambassador in Rome, who was a former student of Galileo's from his days in Padua, and once again, the ever paradoxical, right, and somewhat complicated Francesco Barberini. Campanella fled to the safety of a Parisian monastery and to the political protection of the French. As a result, he became part of Galileo's unorthodox circle of friends in Paris, in Aix, and in other parts of France, supporting his efforts to have a life after the trial. As Campanella wrote to Peiresc in February of 1636, "Signor Galileo communicates often with us by letters that Signor Diodati receives," right? This was a very tight-knit circle, constantly in communication with each other. Increasingly, Galileo saw his letters with these French correspondents as an essential lifeline under altered circumstances to a far better, more open, and tolerant world. This world, by the way, was also in Rome, where an important circle of French Catholics, the French ambassador, Galileo's former student, the librarian Gabriel Naudet, who felt that Galileo belonged in every library, as he would later write, and Francesco Barberini's secretary, a guy named Jean-Jacques Bouchard, who would be roundly censored by the Roman inquisitors a few years later for praising Galileo in speeches and in his writings. All of these figures were present in Rome. So Rome is a complicated place too, right? Rome is filled with Galileo's admirers and former students, as well as his critics. The French community in Rome was an essential conduit for news of Galileo's predicament abroad, and they played a crucial role in the efforts to mitigate the effect of his sentence during the mid-1630s. Roughly around the end of 1634, the beginning of 1635, Galileo heard of Peiresc efforts to use his influence with Cardinal Barberini to mitigate his sentence. So this was the next attempt to try to mitigate it. Diodati had encouraged this idea, knowing how influential Peiresc was as a central figure in the European-wide Republic of Letters, with a great deal of political clout. And he was an intimate of the very pro-French Barberini. Peiresc articulated the moral consciousness of a generation that envisioned the reverberations of the trial down to the present day, when he told Barberini in December of 1634 that the Catholic Church risked turning Galileo into another Socrates. In condemning him, they condemned themselves. Further centuries may find it strange, he observed, sagely remarking that it would be a perpetual blemish upon Urban VIII's papacy. Now, Galileo had not been in communication with Peiresc for decades, even though they'd known each other in Padua. All roads lead to Padua in the end. But when his cousin Roberto, who was a merchant in Lyon, shared a copy of the letter Peiresc had sent to Rome with Galileo, he felt compelled to write a letter himself to France. And he thanked Peiresc for speaking up about what he described as my innocence, when many others, even those well-disposed, remained silent. In this important letter, Galileo offered his own opinion of the trial, remarking that he expected by then absolutely no improvement in his situation because, as he wrote, I committed no crime. So let's think back now to what Galileo was asked to say with a sincere heart, right, and in the full piety of an abjuration. What is the nature of Galileo's sincerity? I committed no crime, right? I am being punished to the full because I committed no crime, because this is not about religion. These were hardly the words of a repentant Catholic who had abjured publicly. Instead, they were the words of a defiant Catholic who believed he remained true to his faith on his own terms, that he believed to be legitimate, more legitimate than the decision that had been made about him. Galileo declared that he took comfort in two facts that he considered indisputable. First, that anyone reading his entire corpus of writings would see that it contained nothing that diminished, as he put it, the piety and reverence of the Holy Church. And secondly, Galileo took refuge in his own conscience. My most religious and saintly mind, as he put it. The inner Galileo and the outer world were increasingly not in sync, or at least parts of them weren't. And parts of them were. And the parts that were lay in places like France or Venice, and to some degree also in Rome. Galileo, in other words, did not see the trial that he'd undergone as a religious investigation, but a political outcome fueled by personal animosities, under what he described as the simulated mask of religion. So again, when we ask ourselves, what is Galileo doing after the trial under his house arrest? He is writing letters to France talking about the simulated mask of religion. Why do we not pay attention to this, right? Why do we not look more carefully at this reality of Galileo's life? Whether Galileo was right was for posterity to decide, and we've been debating this ever since. But it's worth considering these statements as strongly indicative of his state of mind and his desire to have this conversation with his colleagues. Well, Galileo developed a new and far more intimate relationship with his French colleagues after the trial. What he also did was to renew ties with colleagues in the Venetian Republic. Those of you familiar with Galileo's biography will already recall that Galileo spent 18 years of his life, from 1592 until 1610, that year he publishes The Starry Messenger and becomes famous, right, where he was professor of mathematics at the University of Padua. This was where he did his early and important scientific work that laid the foundation both for his astronomy and for his mechanics. This was where he made observations and debated ideas with a close-knit group of friends. His Venetian friends in 1610 were rightfully outraged at what they perceived to be a very calculated decision to dedicate his work to a Medici prince after accepting a raise from the local university and enjoying many other favors facilitated by his Venetian friends. These friends included the highly controversial theologian of the Venetian Republic, Paolo Sarpi, They also included the Venetian patrician, Gianfrancesco Segreto, who would become one of the fictional characters after his death, he dies in 1620, in Galileo's dialogue as a way of remembering their friendship. The Venetians were ultimately disappointed with Galileo's decision to return to Florence in 1610 as court philosopher and mathematician. Galileo, they felt, had abandoned Venice and all that it stood for, a cosmopolitan commercial society with long-standing Republican political traditions that celebrated its liberties, a famously pragmatic openness to foreigners, not only in the marketplace where one made a profit, but in the very university where Galileo taught for almost 2 decades, that was famously known for allowing Protestants, Jews, Greek Orthodox students to study there. This made Padua a very unique university, and it helps to explain the range of his contacts later in life. Galileo's Venetian friends famously warned him at this critical moment that Florence was too near Rome and that Rome could never be as open or as tolerant in Venice. The question we now need to consider is not whether they were right, right? But whether Venice had actually abandoned him during the years that he had moved to Florence. So this turns me to this last part of my talk now, to get you thinking again about this world. Standard biographies of Galileo present his departure of Venice as a radical break, an end of these relationships. And the surviving evidence seems to bear out this presupposition. Galileo, as you see, for instance, in this diagram we've done from all of our mapping of the letters, doesn't correspond a lot with his Venetian friends after returning to Florence. And yet, I think there's a problem with this narrative that bears closer inspection. And you can see it in other ways that we look at the correspondence here. And I'm happy to talk about this later. We've been doing a lot of work on this aspect of the Galileo archive. During 1634, Galileo intensively resumed correspondence with his most important surviving Venetian friend, the Servite monk Fulgenzio Micanzio, who had by then succeeded Paolo Sarpi as the theologian of the Republic of Venice. And I want you to just notice here one of the peculiarities: absolutely no letters in the year of the trial, an intense uptick in their correspondence in the year after the trial. Right, this again is the record that survives, and we need to say that, the record that survives, not necessarily a full reflection of the record that was. But what to make of it, what to make of the surviving evidence, is always a very interesting question. In November of 1634, still reeling from the calamities of the past year, which had included the death of his daughter, Galileo finally found a moment to respond to some of Micanzio's letters that he'd been sending literally every week to Galileo. Micanzio was encouraging Galileo to reprint some of his most important works that had not been censored by the church. Indeed, he was offering to facilitate these publications. He encouraged Galileo to continue to make progress on his 2 new sciences, though Galileo confessed it was hard to concentrate when he was so disturbed with what he called mio cervello inquieto, right, his unquiet mind. In short, after Rome censored Galileo and Florence failed to protect him from the church's wrath, his Venetian friends now offered an exit strategy, a second life that would preserve what mattered most: Galileo's work in print, his contributions to knowledge. At the time Micanzio had this discussion with Galileo, the Latin translation of the dialogue was already underway. From Paris in 1634, Diodati informed Galileo that the Lutheran theologian and professor of history, Martin Berniger, who previously translated Galileo's little treatise on the geometric and military compass, was undertaking this new translation. So as a preventive measure, Galileo writes to Berniger in Strasbourg in July, and he says, "I'd like to state officially that I have no direct involvement in this translation." That was a good move, right? But at the same time, in the same letter, he also indicates his pleasure at the prospect that the book would now have a wider audience. So again, what are we to make of this attitude, right? Or what are we to make of thinking about the nature of Galileo's penitence, right? This is clearly a form of resistance and moving on already. This exchange occurs 1 month before Galileo's dialogue was officially added to the Index of Prohibited Books. So in short, just to give you a sense of these things, what happens, after this is a kind of tangled web of where and how to publish Galileo. Michanzio had thought that he would publish Galileo in Venice. It was the center of the publishing industry in Italy. This proved quickly to be impossible because the reach of Rome in this period had finally, because of the trial of Galileo, because of larger changing political circumstances, reached all the way to the Venetian Inquisition, infamously resistant to Rome in many other instances. This was a city that had been put under papal interdict when Sarpi was theologian, when Galileo was teaching at Padua. But in this instance, the Venetian inquisitor said, no, you not only can't publish the dialogue, you cannot publish any works Galileo has published or will publish. So Venice was absolutely out, at which point Michanzio begins to collaborate with this whole French community I've been putting together for you. He begins to develop a collaborative relationship to facilitate the publications that actually do happen in the same period in which Galileo's disciples in Rome increasingly begin to work intensively in the 1630s and 40s during his life and beyond his death on developing the implications of the many aspects of Galileo's physics and mathematics that do not apply to astronomy directly, right? They begin to help develop and become the centerpiece of the Galilean school of thought that establishes a long tradition of Galilean physics in Italy for the next centuries. But what about Galileo's books? I want to end with you thinking about some of these final artifacts of this world after the trial, right? The world that was made because of the trial and the world that Galileo contributed to. The Latin edition of the dialogue appeared in Strasbourg in 1635. The letter to the Grand Duchess Christina that had never been published was quickly published. They'd initially thought to put them together, but it was quickly published as an afterthought, along with other texts on science and religion that had been published with this, right? So Strasbourg, with Berneger's translations, with Diodati's translations, Diodati is the primary translator of the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, as far as we can tell. This collaboration between Venice, Paris, Strasbourg produces these important documents outside of the world of Catholic Italy. By 1638, Galileo had finally exerted the great mental and psychic effort he needed while going blind to produce his two new sciences. They too would be published in Protestant Europe, in this instance in one of the other great centers, emerging centers of the publishing industry, Leiden, right, the Dutch university town of Leiden in 1638. Again, facilitated. The Elsevier Press still exists today, right? It's an interesting fact. You know, if you go on their website, you'll see they point to this as one of their early publications, right? They're still a big publisher of scientific books and journals. The Elsevier Press, Galileo is put together with the Elsevier Press, again, thanks to his friends in Venice and in France, right? So this set of friends that he talks to initially individually increasingly coalesces as a community that will facilitate his projects, the exiting of his work, ultimately the translation of his works into other languages. Mersenn's commentaries that include a great deal of Galileo's works as well as Mersenn's own perspective on Galileo's mechanics appear also in this period in the 1630s. So by 1639, there are these two French works by Mersenne that also put forth the new thoughts of Galileo, right? Not just the old thoughts, but the new thoughts of Galileo. So it's a very interesting title to think about. And finally, after Galileo's lifetime, an English translation that one can still read today online, or in a rare books library if you wish, appears. So how now do we see the trial of Galileo? How do we think about these final years of Galileo's life? Galileo's relationship to his world had indeed changed quite dramatically because of the events of 1633. But I think that we can safely say that his attitudes about his Catholicism, not about the institutional church, his attitudes about his Catholicism had not changed. And this brings me to sort of the final point that I would really like to make about Galileo for your consideration, that in many ways, one of the dilemmas of the Galileo, of the world that he lived in, was to be a Catholic of the late Renaissance in the age of the Counter-Reformation, to be a Catholic who believed in the Catholicism of 16th century humanists like Erasmus, a Catholicism that was open to new ideas, a Catholicism that was suspicious of institutions, a Catholicism that indeed sought to unify rather than to separate the best ideas of knowledge as well as faith. To be this kind of person in 1633 was increasingly a problem. But to not be this kind of person posed an even greater dilemma for somebody like Galileo. So if anything, I think that the events of the trial lead us to really, in many ways, see a Galileo in the final years as he absolutely was when stripped away of all of his success and institutional support, to see a man who believes strongly in the path to truth as something that he absolutely had to pursue no matter what. Having said this, I don't want to turn Galileo into an absolute hero. He was a flesh and blood human being with all the weaknesses that come with it, with all the compromises he made at other points in his life, to the despair of his Venetian friends who believed rightfully that these were compromises. But in this later period of his life, he indeed focused on what was left when that world had left him behind. And this, in short, of course, is the Galileo who is mythologized in paintings like this one done in the 19th century of Galileo in Arcetri, discussing the work on his two new sciences with his last disciple, Vincenzo Viviani, who arrived practically a teenager, one of the many people assisting Galileo once he goes blind in 1637-38, assisting him in writing letters, in reading work, in completing the editing and transcribing of all of the work that he's done over his lifetime. This is the Galileo who ultimately will be defiantly placed in the monument, the biography that Viviani wrote not only on paper, a biography that was not published until the 18th century, but that he also wrote in his own lifetime and placed over the door of his own house with a bust of Galileo. And this is the Galileo who will be dug up by a different century, by yet another changing world, in 1737, to be finally buried with pomp and ceremony, as the Florentines had wanted to do in 1642, but to be finally buried almost a century later in Santa Croce, a place for Florentine heroes. And in that moment to also be treated in the odor of sanctity, as Viviani put it, that they felt the scientist deserved when they cut off the 3 fingers with which he wrote and one of his vertebrae, parts of which you can still see today if you go to the Museo Galileo in Florence. So thank you very much for listening to this talk. I look forward to your questions.
Time for maybe a couple of questions before the book signing. Have at it, folks. Surely someone has a question.
I'm Franco Romano, professor of Italian. I do 17th century Rome. My question is, why did Galileo, with powerful friends like the Grand Duca of Tuscany, even go to Rome for the trial? He could have simply stayed away. In this period, Urban VIII was under great pressure. He was being attacked from all sides. He could, with friends like the Grand Duca, Galileo could have escaped that fate that he did. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, it is a bit of the ongoing puzzle. And I mean, the standard explanation is that Tuscany politically is in a somewhat subordinate relationship to Rome. And I'm not entirely convinced about that explanation, because actually if you look at the politics of Tuscany during this period, they're much more closely tied to the Habsburgs. They're fighting, this is why people like Ottavio Piccolomini, the brother of the Archbishop of Siena, is going off to war and becoming one of the famous generals of the 30 Years' War. So the Tuscans, even members of the Medici, are doing this. So yeah, I think this does remain one of the greatest mysteries, is why can't he resist further, as his friends suggested? Why not just go to Venice? Right? One doesn't even have to go all the way to Paris like Campanella does. Why not just go to Venice? Well, you could say one, family circumstances had increasingly bound Galileo, of course, to the world in Tuscany. So he wasn't just going to abandon that. So there's that issue. But I think the other reason is because he really does not understand that he can't get out of this predicament, because he doesn't yet, the predicament hasn't fully unfolded. So I think there's some sense, when you think about what he, in 1615, when he hears that there is this possibility that Copernicus is going to end up on the index, what does he do? He goes to Rome to defend it. And when you think about one of the many details I threw into this talk, and hopefully not overwhelming you with too many of them, but trying to lay out some of these things, I love this fact that in 1632, when he finally is reluctantly, he's been pleading ill health as a way of getting out of having to go, and finally they say, no, we're having none of it. So one thing we can also say is he's too sick to just simply get up and run, right? So that seems to be maybe a physical limitation to some degree. But really, I think, in the end, he thinks he can repeat what he did in 1615-16. And that's why he's bringing the letter to the Grand Duchess basically with him and saying, would you like to read this? Would you like to look at my manifesto as a layperson on the proper relationship between science and faith and how these passages, in Joshua, etc., are compatible with a heliocentric worldview based on my reading of this? That is a very Erasmian thing to do. And, so I think that he mistakenly thought that even though his political relationship with Rome had changed quite dramatically in the previous year or two before the trial because of the death of key patrons in Rome, that in the end, he always has been able to argue his way out of difficult situations. That is his MO in life. But it didn't work this time, and then what we see in the trial documents unfolds. But even to the end, I'm always struck by by the optimism until the final moment of things when he really, I think even while he is on trial, even as this is moving forward, I think he thinks this is not going to end this badly. Yeah, so right, trapped a bit by your own sense of how you handle things, for sure.